Acquiring religious tolerance from the crown for their faithful did not mean the Puritans were eager to despoil their city upon a hill with the presence of nonconformers. In this section, we will discuss how religious views that did not conform with the Congregational Church caused conflict in the puritanical Massachusetts and led to the creation of new colonies in New England. Two Puritan nonconformists that drew the wrath of the Puritan establishment include Anne Hutchinson and Roger Williams. Hutchinson stood trial for preaching the gospel, a crime in a society that only permitted men to be ministers. Governor Winthrop prosecuted Hutchinson himself, attacking her for her haughtiness. "You have rather been a husband than a wife, a preacher than a hearer, and a magistrate than a subject," quoted Winthrop. Hutchinson defended her actions using antinomianism philosophy, that she did not have to follow the laws of Massachusetts because she was acting on a higher religious authority. In essence, because she had received her conversion experience, it wasn't wrong for her to take and break the laws that prevented her from preaching. When pressed to explain how she knew it was God's will that she become a minister, Anne Hutchinson committed an even graver offense and claimed that she had been directly communicating with God. Believing God would never communicate directly with anyone, let alone a woman, the governor of Massachusetts excommunicated Anne Hutchinson from the Congregational Church and banished her to the unsettled territory of Rhode Island. Later, fearing that Rhode Island colony would be taken over by Massachusetts, she fled to the Dutch territory of New Amsterdam, now New York. When she and 9 of her family members were massacred by local Indians for squatting on their land, Hutchinson's death was celebrated back in Massachusetts as a righteous act of God and his justice against a heretic. This statue is called the Dissenter. It's of Anne Hutchinson. She held unorthodox views that challenged the authority of the clergy and the very integrity of the Puritan experiment in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. An outcast in her day, she has been judged as a heroine in the eyes of history. This statue in her honor, erected in the 19th century, now graces the front of the Boston, Massachusetts State House. When Anne Hutchinson was exiled from Massachusetts in 1638, she was welcomed into neighboring and newly formed Providence Plantation, now Rhode Island, which had been established by another religious outcast, Roger Williams. Williams had been a minister in the village of Salem until he was expelled in 1635 for sedition, betraying his country, and heresy, violating the church's authority. Williams, a Puritan firebrand, found himself being banished from the Puritan society when he became demanding that the Congregational Church make a clean split from the Church of England. Remember, John Winthrop had promised to reestablish the Church of England in Massachusetts, technically making the King of England the head of the Congregational Church as well. This is where the charge of heresy comes from. To make matters worse, Williams, who had befriended the Narragansett Indians of the Boston area, publicly criticized the Crown's treatment of the Indians and their claims to land in North America without payment as illegal, hence the charge of sedition. In the spring of 1636, Williams and his followers purchased land from the Narragansett and the Wampanoag Indians south of Massachusetts and the Plymouth colonies in a territory that had become known as Rhode Island. He named the new colony Providence in honor of what he felt was God's guiding hand in leading his people to a place where they could live without conflict of conscience. The charter members of the colony almost immediately agreed to adopt a protection that would defend the liberty of conscience, making Rhode Island the first colony to embrace religious tolerance for all faiths, including Catholics and non-Christians. Roger Williams himself went on to be the first governor of Providence and created America's first Baptist church, a Protestant denomination that had developed in England and practiced adult baptism, as opposed to baptizing infants, as was the tradition in the Catholic and Anglican churches. But the government of Rhode Island demonstrated its commitment to religious freedom by requiring no religious oaths from its citizens or compulsory church attendance, and it rejected the establishment of a tax-funded church. Other religious refugees followed Williams and Hutchinson to the tolerant colony, including Quakers, who would go on to form Pennsylvania. Because of religious diversity and tolerance that developed in Rhode Island, traditional Puritans considered the colony to be the sewer of New England. But it has also become known as the traditional home of the otherwise minded. The liberal nature of the otherwise minded Rhode Islanders did not stop at religious tolerance. The colony was uniquely more democratic, initially granting simple manhood suffrage, meaning there was no property requirement for male voters. The mistreatment of Rhode Islanders' experience when they had lived in Massachusetts Bay made them scornful of privilege and stubbornly independent. Today, a huge bronze statue of the independent man decorates the dome of the Rhode Island Capitol in Providence. Four other New England colonies worth mentioning were shaped by geography and crown politics during the 17th century. As Massachusetts Bay Colony grew, Puritan squatters began looking for new territory and fertile soil beyond the hub of Boston. 5 years after the founding of the Bay Colony, Puritan settlers, led by Minister Thomas Hooker, had fanned out south and west to the fertile river basin of the Connecticut River Valley, where they established the port colony of Hartford. This colony would be one of the first to create a modern, written constitution that documented the responsibilities of the government and bound it to the will of its citizens. Another group of Puritan squatters would establish nearby New Haven, on the shores of Long Island Sound, with the same hopes of creating a prosperous seaport. But the two colonies would be unified in 1622 as Connecticut, out of spite by King Charles II, when he discovered that New Haven citizens had sheltered fugitive judges wanted for condemning his father, Charles I, to death. More than farming, aquaculture became an economic staple of New England. It was said that the one thing the Puritans loved more than God was cod. At the same time Plymouth was established, the territory of Maine had been given to an old English lord by the name of Ferdinando Gorges, who had intended to create fishing colonies there in 1623. But efforts to colonize this remote wilderness would not take off until 1670, when Massachusetts purchased the land from George's heirs and transplanted settlers there. Maine would not become independent from Massachusetts again until it was part of a compromise on slavery in 1820. In fact, fishing had been causing Puritan settlements to slowly stretch northward towards the St. Lawrence River for 3 decades. Massachusetts Bay laid claim to the intermediate territory of New Hampshire in 1641, although Charles II would again demonstrate his annoyance with insubordinate colonials and control them by separating the two in 1679, just because he could. The 17th century New England settlements are identified on this map. The Massachusetts Bay Colony was the hub of New England. The best mnemonic device I can give you to remember how New England morphed into more colonies, and the colonies that we know as part of the original United States, is in the following way. Remember this date, 1630. That was the year Massachusetts was chartered. All earlier colonies, which would include Maine and Plymouth, grew into it, so they became a part of Massachusetts Bay. All later colonies, so colonies that developed after 1630, that would include Connecticut, Rhode Island, and New Hampshire, grew out of it. So they started as part of Massachusetts Bay and broke off and became independent royal colonies.